Good morning, North America. Welcome to Church Talk, lively conversation for all things church transformation. I'm your co-host, Dr. Bill Tenney Britton, in our studio in Columbia, Missouri, the heartland of the U.S. And I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host, author and denominational leader, Dr. Kris Tenney Britton, the area minister of the Northeast area of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ of Mid-America. Try and say that 3 times fast. Good morning, Kris.
Well, good morning, and welcome to Church Talk Live.
Bill and Kris Tenney Britton here today to talk to you about how to do worship or how to encourage worship, how to get your people, and perhaps yourself, to do worship outside of your sanctuary, your worship center, your auditorium, whatever you happen to call the large space where lots of people gather for corporate worship every week.
You know, we have this misconception that worship can only happen when we're with a group of other people in some special worship space that has been specifically dedicated, consecrated, or otherwise set aside. And what we want to offer today is that the quality of the worship that we can have when we come together, that corporate worship, is directly dependent upon the quality of the personal worship, the worship that each worshiper is doing between that corporate time. So when we all come together for that hour or 2 hours or whatever it is, that we will bring with us already an abundance of worship that will then just magnify exponentially in our worship together.
Well, I think it's important for us to start off by saying that there's been a move over, it's probably been 20, 30, maybe even as many as 50 years of moving churches into a corporate worship place where corporate worship was really the key to church worship. And of course, that comes from a very solid biblical understanding of the Old Testament, where there really isn't a lot of personal worship going on. Yes, there is some, but in general, the worship that is spoken about and taught about and practiced is generally about all of Israel or about particular tribes or families as they come to worship, and it's done in a central location, and that's primarily where it happens. And there's been a lot of movement into, well, that's what church ought to look like.
You know what, I want to kind of challenge that idea, because you've got, in the earlier parts of the Old Testament, you have all these examples of stones being set up, here I raise my Ebenezer, right. We still sing that song. And that is that standing up a mark that a touch of the holy, an exchange with God took place there, and they wanted people to know that. And it was a way also of thanking God, which is really a part of worship.
I don't argue with that. With this piece, though, is that as Israel came together, coalesced as a nation,
I agree that.
They built the tabernacle, sure. And we see that the Ebenezers and all that,
right,
almost come to a screeching halt. Right. In fact, I don't believe we see any more after the tabernacle, and certainly none after the temple is built.
Sure.
It becomes, in fact, we may remember that in the exile, Israel was at a place where they weren't even sure how they could worship without having access to the temple. And so this corporate worship became key. And it translated into today. And in fact, I can remember very much in seminary, we won't say how long ago that was, but there were 2 schools of thought. There were those who said that corporate worship was really the more formal and the way worship ought to be, and that if you were doing the personal worship, and there was a lot of pushback against the contemporary music of the day, that it's all about I, and when we're there as a group, we're doing as together. And I understand that, with the reservation that what happened is that we taught corporate worship and we have left out personal worship, to the detriment, I believe, of the church.
Of the corporate worship at that.
Yeah, well, I agree. I agree. So let's talk about what is worship.
Well, wait a second. I want to go back to that for a second, because between personal and corporate worship, it's not an either or. It's a both and. So we need to keep that in front of us. Well, how do you define worship? We have books on our shelf, stacks of books that define worship in lots of different ways. But I went to Webster's, and as you know, you can download, or hopefully you can download download below the handout for this week, and you'll see on there Merriam-Webster defines worship as reverence offered a divine being or supernatural power, a form of religious practice with its creed and ritual, and extravagant respect or admiration for or devotion to an object of esteem, we would say in this case to God. And
or not, as the case may
well,
be.
I know a lot of people don't worship God; they
right.
worship other things.
Yeah, right. They worship their job, their money, their family, their
cars,
relationships, whatever. Right. But
okay.
Speaking of church worship, we're talking about worshiping God, right?
And true worship, if you ask me.
Right.
But okay, and if you go to worship.com, you can find a whole compendium of definitions that come from real worshipers, today's worshipers and ministers, theologians, so you can get that. But I like, honestly, worship.com's talking about worship, and that is to say that worship is a way of life, that it is how we live out our life. But I want to push back against that, because the way we live our life, we don't do that consciously in worship, right? We more often, life is living us. And sometimes we're intentionally trying to live life. But to do that in having this, worship is even more than that conversation with God. Worship is that reverencing of God, to go back to that definition. And so when we're talking about worship here, I mean, you tell me if I'm not speaking for you here, but worship is this time that we step away to put our concentration, our intentional consciousness on God, to reverence God, to give God back what God is due. Some people would say to magnify God. And so kind of like we're a reflection of God.
Okay, well, I will push back and offer, but not totally. I really overall agree with you that my one disagreement is that I believe that a life can be all we do is worship. I think that work can be worship, and that in an ideal situation, that it could all be on some level worship. I will agree with you. It doesn't happen with the vast majority, and in fact, I don't know that I've ever known anyone that it really happened with, but I can point to the practice of the presence of God by Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection.
I get that. That's
who
right.
Really spent that time in worship and communion with God. And for me, worship is there is the bestowing worth upon God, if you will, but there's also worship is very much a part of spending time, mindful time with God, and it doesn't have to be on your face going, oh God, you're so wonderful, you're so awesome, whatever. That if we're mindful and so on with God as we walk, that can be at least a part of worship. It can't be the all of worship, but it can be the part. So with that difference of opinion slightly, and I don't know that we're really differencing in opinion here, but that let's move forward and talk about some of the ways of worship. Different ways of worship. What does worship look like?
Sure. Well, there's corporate styles of worship, and we were talking about this before the show started. That these corporate styles can also reflect personal styles,
yes, they can.
If you will.
Absolutely.
So some of us really hearken towards the traditional. Excuse me. We hearken towards the traditional, where we want to use organ music or a certain kind of music, or strong, strict literature or ritual there. Some of us are more charismatic, so that we may want to be dancing as part of what we do. Some
or speaking
of us
in tongues, or etc.
Right. Okay. Some of us are non-instrumental, and some of us are more instrumental. Some of us lean more towards the contemporary type of music. Some of us are more quiet-centered in our worship. So things like tezé or sitting quietly and meditating would be a form of worship for us.
I think of in a worship service that in many churches the prelude time, where the music's quietly playing in the front, and anyone who walks in the worship center, there's a sense in which you sit and you get quiet and you get centered, and you're there in the presence. And so that's that's a quiet style of worship, at least at that moment.
Okay, so but then, okay, we can get that even more direct as we talk about personal styles of worship.
Right. Well, there's a number of different personal styles of worship, or actually, I would say these aren't so much styles as they are practices of worship. And as you listen to us speak of these, I want to encourage you, particularly if you're a church leader, to be taking some notes, if you will, on just in your own head of, oh, I hadn't thought about that, or we're not talking about that. How do I encourage my congregation and individuals in my congregation to practice different ways? Because although there's probably going to be nothing here that's rocket science or brand new, that helping your congregation to improve the quality of their personal worship will, of course, improve the quality of your corporate worship. So be thinking how this can work. So let's talk about music. Worship in singing is a huge piece, no matter what you're singing, but also music in terms of instrumental stuff.
Sure.
When we started our church in Seattle, we had a young man who was our lead guitar player, and he wasn't really big into singing, and he wasn't into most forms of what we would consider traditional worship. But when you watched him play, and particularly when he was playing in between at rehearsals and whatnot, you would see him just sort of fall into this place where he was worshiping God with the music, and it became it wasn't random, it was beautiful music, but it was him expressing himself through that music. And so that's a very clear and classic form, if you will, of personal worship.
Though, as you're saying that about singing, there's a difference about just singing and singing to God.
Oh, I agree.
That's where I really want to come home on this, is that when we're worshiping, it is for God. And so that singing isn't just like, I ride down the road and there are some times when I'm just singing with the radio, and there are sometimes when I am able to be conscious enough to make those words my own to God. This is worship, getting deeper than just the head.
Going back to the beginning of the show, it's about mindfulness.
Right.
Mindfulness of the presence of God. And that is really, I would say, the difference, because you're right. You can be singing along, just passing time. We all do that as well. So
sure. Okay. Right. So other ways to worship, personal ways, dance. Some people dance. I know people who have flags and love to dance through their homes because they don't get to do that at church.
Right. And there's dancing with flags. If you have low ceilings, probably not a good idea. But there's also dancing with ribbons.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Right.
Actually, as
and
I was
ribbons,
envisioning
even low ceiling with ribbons, you're okay.
Exactly.
So
prayer.
That's right.
In prayer, there's meditation, there's contemplation,
reflection.
There's reflection, trying to practice the presence, trying to center in.
Well, I want to talk about practice the presence for a moment, because some of you may be unfamiliar with what we're talking about, and we highly recommend the book by Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection, Practice the Presence of God. It's in public domain. You can get it almost anywhere for free. It's online. And but practicing the presence really is a way of spending time, if you will, in conversation with God literally every waking moment or nearly. And that's, of course, the goal. And it really is just being centered, but being centered and practicing the presence of God, practicing being in the presence and recognizing really what you're practicing, recognizing that presence. So a very important part of worship.
Okay, so others, do you want to say this? Want to add?
Well, there's centering, just
sure,
where
just mentioned that.
Yep, and then for me, I love labyrinth walking.
Yes.
Or just walking anywhere where I am, again, mindful walking. The Buddhist theologian Thich Nhat Hanh, who reflects a lot of Christian concepts, as well as actually holds Jesus Christ quite high. But, he talks very much about this mindfulness of taking one step at a time and being mindful as you walk, so your walking becomes very slow, or generally slow, and being very aware of what's around you, but also being very aware, of course, in worship, being very aware that God is around you as you walk.
Well, there's an ancient Christian form of meditative walking, or called the tripodium, for 3 steps, where you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And so it's this movement and back. And
that's actually, I'm being serious here. That's actually a method of of worship or mindfulness walking?
Yes, it's Christian and
it's
it's
interesting.
ancient. I think I want to say goes back to the 500s, which may be too long
Well,
ago.
it goes. I mean, the 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's always about
Oh
progress and
yes,
whatnot.
okay.
But
Well,
here you
no,
are,
it's
exactly what you're
within
saying.
that worship.
So,
Yeah,
right.
there brings back that mindfulness and that being able to give it back to God. Well, some of us like to write or to read in worship, but there's that writing. There's art
and there's reciting, of course,
reciting, right? Art.
right? Wordless kind of worship, where you're creating something not with words, maybe again art. Painting is of course very popular, but I want to go beyond just that kind of art in wordless. But also one of the ways we both worship is going to some place that has for us great majesty. You love the ocean, and I get some of it from the ocean. But I get it from being in the forest, and where the majesty of all of creation and the presence of God, and that can just be overwhelming. And it really is, it's almost a mindlessness where you clear your mind and just imbue the presence of God as you just marvel at creation. I do it sometimes under the stars as well.
Yes, well, I was thinking there's a song that talks about mountains bow down and the seas will roar at the sound of your name. And there are points I can go to in my mind when we moved to Seattle that I realized, oh my gosh, that's what we're talking about. Because you'd get the mountains and you'd get the sea, and you could just imagine how great God was, and then to turn that into a prayer, a way of praising. Okay, so let's...
I want to touch the last one
go ahead,
that you
go
didn't
ahead.
touch, okay?
Oh, okay.
And that is work. And very often we leave out work as an act of worship and as a part of worship. And yes, if you have a job and it is just a job and you're flipping burgers or driving a bus or whatever it is, if it's just a job, it can be very difficult to move that into worship. But if you, on the other hand, are within your passion, you're living and working within your passion, it can be a very small step from giving and worshipful work as you, and even I guess driving bus, if you hate driving bus or whatever, could also be worshipful work as you offer and lift up as you're doing that as a ministry, because it is.
Right. And I just have to say, though, I want to keep pushing back on this, because worship is to God. And a lot of these pieces that we're talking about call for interaction. And in that interaction, the focus is here and not with there. And I know that we're trying to say, well, it can be here, but humanly, it is almost impossible. And yes, there are those models. I know there are those models who are able to do that, but still, it gets to too much of this.
But I think the ideal is what's important is to
today you're the idealist.
Isn't it amazing?
Yes,
I can do that sometimes.
I just can't imagine, and I'm the realist.
There you are. sort of different shoes today. No wonder my feet feel cramped. Anyway, so and again, I push back that work can be, but it is. Again, it's about mindfulness, and it is about offering yourself and what you're doing to God. So
yeah, well, I do have a friend who has many different hats that she wears within the life of her job, and so she has different colored candles for those different parts. And part of her morning routine and her morning meditation is asking God, kind of sitting there with her to-dos and her calendar and saying, okay, God, what do you want to be a priority? And in that silent time, she gets a sense of that. And then she lights that candle. And that candle then becomes a reminder of why she's doing that and of its priority. So, yeah, okay. I think that's kind of a cool idea. Okay.
All right. So, move along.
Okay, so we want to talk about now how we can encourage the worship outside the sanctuary, particularly if you're a congregational leader or a pastor yourself. We've already said the quality of your worship, corporate worship, is completely dependent. It's directly correlated to the personal worship of your parishioners. And so, how then can we encourage them, each and every one, as much as possible, to incorporate and have their own personal worship?
Well, and I want to say that this is an extremely important practice that you will probably want to incorporate in what you do as a worship leader or as a church leader. I don't know how many churches we go to where people say, well, our worship is just dead. It's like God doesn't show up. And I would say that in most of those cases, there's one of two things. Either they got conflict going on, and we recommend, there's lots of conflict. We have a conflict DVD set, plus there's conflict episodes here at Church Talk. But beyond that, very often it's because the corporate worship has lost its meaning and lost its spirit, if you will. Go ahead.
Well, it's not that God isn't there.
Right.
It's just that the worship service is no longer conducive for helping to bring people into God's presence.
Right.
Right? And
Right.
that's really what worship is in this context that we're talking about today. Worship is a context for being in contact with God.
So if you raise up the personal level of worship of even a small crowd or an intransigent crowd, if you can move them into that, you can revitalize your worship service way, way above what you could possibly even imagine in reality. And we've seen it happen. We've done it, and we just want to encourage you to encourage your individuals to be worshiping outside the sanctuary, but also learning how to worship individually.
This is one of the key responders, or we'll just say that, responses to, I don't get fed in worship. The worship doesn't feed me. Hello. All right. Well, let's move into this because.
All right.
Do you want to start?
Let me start with first. I'll let you finish up. All right. Okay. Hey, the first thing you need. Hey, you need to teach and preach it. You need to talk about the person-centeredness of worship. That it isn't about all of us. It's about
well, it is, but it's more.
Well, right. It's also about all y'all.
Right.
It's you and you and you and you and the coming together and you coming into a place of worship and not waiting for everyone else to do it for you.
It's all of us and each of us.
Right.
Right? It's
Right.
all and each.
Right. But if the each isn't doing it,
Right.
the all will never happen.
Suffers.
That's
Yeah.
right. The all will never happen if
Right.
the each aren't doing it.
Right. Well, and one of the keys to that is to make sure that your language in worship includes not just we language, but I language as well. The confession of faith that many congregations use is...
or the confession of sins.
Well, that's
right.
that's what I'm trying to say. I'm sorry. That's exactly what I want to refer to. Yeah, is
very much a we. We
yeah.
have sinned.
Forgive us. We have
right.
sinned. Da la la. And I always I pause. And in fact, when I've pastored, I rewrite it. And I have a colleague who has rewritten it for his congregation. I just love that, Jim Walker, because it really brings it home to the part that we play in it, and we keep just giving up our personal responsibilities and our personal privilege when it comes to worship and get sucked in to the whole. So what we're trying, that sounds kind of Buddhist, doesn't it? So change out your language in the confession of faith. I have sinned. Give a chance for people to reflect on the sin that they have brought. Now you could say forgive us, and bring in the forgiveness to all at that point. But people need to be in that personal piece. The songs that we sing, you've made mention of that. But we will remind you that a number of songs in the mainline hymnals have I language in them as well. So we got to be really careful about what we pick and choose and talk.
And we're not saying to stop the corporate stuff,
Just
but we are saying you have to make sure that at every worship service that we're calling attention to the personal responsibility, not just the corporate responsibility, moving from we to I. And, there's in the flow of worship, you can start with the we and move into I, which makes it nice when it comes time for personal worship of giving offerings and doing communion and making response to the sermon and so on. So that's the first part of it. You got to teach it, you got to preach it. The other piece is, church leaders, you have to model it. If you're not doing it, your congregation won't do it, and you have to be a personal model of personal worship.
It's not haughty to say, in my personal worship time last Thursday, or as I was worshiping on Tuesday, or, this scripture that was with me each day, that's not haughty, and that says to people, hey, we're doing it. If you're a preacher, or a pastor, a minister, it's really good to get people that are not ministers up there to talk about those kind of pieces, or to help teach your people how to weave those in during things like the offering meditations or other parts of your corporate worship service, so that people are able to hear how people are incorporating personal worship into their lives.
But I want to say that you go beyond talking about it. You also want to demonstrate it.
Keep going.
I think of Wayne Cordero at New Hope Oahu, who invites anyone in his congregation to join him for personal devotions at this coffee shop that he jogs to virtually every morning. And he tells me, you can't talk to me. I'm doing my personal worship, my personal devotional time, but you can join me and they can see it happen. So you have to model. If you're not modeling it, they won't do it. The next thing you have to do is you have to build a bridge from sanctuary to personal or to home. If you want people worshiping out there, you've got to build a bridge. And especially in folks who were raised in the church, they may not know how to worship at home. And I mean, they'll have, okay, well, I can sing or whatever, but they may not. So we have, on the handout, we have a list of how to create personal space, personal worship space, and how to create or a personal worship outline that you can share. And we just want to, we're running out of time desperately.
Yeah.
So we want to call that to your attention to look at. So you can teach your people about how to create this personal space and this outline. But Kris has developed a kit that she uses, and it's not like you can email us and we're sending it or selling it. But here, this is some of the things that she has that she carries with her for personal worship.
Personal worship. Well, let me say that I have a larger piece that is in my suitcase that I take with me, and that came about because a friend of mine went to France and brought me back a little, a neat little gift, and said to me, "Here, this is for your traveling altar." And I was like, "My what?" And I never thought about that, and so it has a lot of different pieces in there, including little dolls that come from Guatemala that represent different parts of the family, and I put them on there when I'm on retreat to kind of like give Bill and the kids over to God and the grandkids over to God, so I don't have to worry about them. And when I'm there, it's this, very visible reminder that, that they are God's and have been God's, and they're well taken care of, and I don't have to worry about it. But, just little things like this. This is a little, some people might use it to say the rosary. I do it as a way of focusing. Here's another one that focuses. I have oil in here that I carry with me as a reminder of what God can do, and helps me with Thanksgiving. I have my little band that's got pieces on here that reminds me of parts.
Symbols and colors.
I have my prayer bracelet, and I generally carry one or two of those in these kits. So I've got all kinds of little things that help to keep me focused. And all around our house, even we've got at least a couple places in our house where we have you might call it altar space, or a worship space set aside, that it reminds us who we are and whose we are and who our home belongs to, and are really just great for singing in front of. And I'm loving, because the one down in our quiet space in our library, our grandson Ethan, the wonder grandbaby who's 6, regularly comes in and moves the little icons and statues around, so I know he's in there kind of interacting with all of that. Okay, so do you want to add to that?
Okay, no, let's move on. Because once you've helped people begin to do, if you will, personal worship at home, and more, of course, what we're offering here is more of a ritualized or liturgical worship, but then you have to help them move from their formal into a less formal setting.
Well, I want to say one more piece with this, because as we're taping this, we're at the end of October, and that countdown to Christmas, many of us know it as Advent, is coming, and that is a great time to provide resources that help families, Advent wreaths, lighting candles, opening calendars, things like that. And those are ready-made resources that are out there that you don't have to create. And if you've been using that and they're not working for you, then create create something, maybe not for this year, but for next year. And Lent, the countdown to Easter, is another time that's really conducive. So be looking at those ways, maybe not all the year around yet, maybe it's time to go all the year around, that you're helping to build the bridge from what you're doing at the church and what people are able to do in their homes.
All right. Right. Well, the
Okay,
next piece is,
so-
again, move it to informal. And you can do that. One of the great ways of doing it is to do some worship classes. Maybe do a small group or a series of classes, a 4-week or 6-week session that walks people through a variety of and a variety of practices, and they can take them home. And you want to keep it forefront when they return, when you see them in church or whatever. How is that working for you? What was your experience? How can you tweak it? How could we tweak it? And we want to keep it forefront in front of the congregation, the corporate congregation as well. Again, preaching, teaching, reminding people. Ask about it. How is your personal worship going? What did you do this week to personally worship? You can always, of course, use your newsletter and etc. to suggest new ways. Keep your eyes open for new ways of doing it, and encourage people to experiment.
Right. And you could, take them out on retreat and introduce different formats. You could do even a daily retreat or do it once a week. Or I'm thinking weekdays and set aside 12 to 12:15 at your church. Anybody who's at the church, nearby the church, can come in and do personal type of exercises, if you will, or practices or disciplines, so people can understand that they're worshiping there, but they're easy enough to do within their home.
All right. We're out of time?
Yeah, we are.
Yeah,
we are so out of time.
So we'll see you next week.
Hey, have a great week.